So you can see how, we were naive in thinking that we could use an online, survey to get as many people as possible, that we would get, a diversified sample. So you notice that our sample was not as diversified as we had hoped. Of course, a majority of participants were mothers, and that's pretty common in this kind of research. So we have to make better efforts to get dads or other family members involved. Our survey was only in English, and that was obviously a limitation that we had. But of course, it requires a lot of extra effort and money to translate items and make sure that also they have to be psychometrically appropriate and so on. So we didn't have the luxury of doing that. The majority of participants were from Greater Vancouver. We were not successful at reaching people in the more rural areas, more remote areas. So that's another effort that probably has to be quite targeted. And our participants had quite high family incomes. I think our average family income was above the national average.
Yeah.
And the provincial average. So these are families who are doing well financially. Education levels were also exceptionally high. I think again, how many of our participants had a post-secondary education? Yeah. So you can see we got a nice university sample, but certainly doesn't represent all of BC, right? So we have a lot of work to do. So the study is ongoing, and we encourage you, if you know any families that would like to participate, to please contact our research lab. And so the next step in this is now to become more targeted in our focus, and to maybe try to sort of consider how to reach hard-to-reach populations. And we know we did a little bit of research on this, looked at some of the literature that's out there, not on ASD, but in other areas. Sort of, one was on in the nursing literature, that's right, yeah. Or for example, homeless people or sex trade workers, where that, this is a population where there are no boundaries in terms of who they are or where to find them, right? And in a way, we have to kind of treat this in a similar way, because there are probably lots of families out there that have children who have autism who haven't even been diagnosed, right? And it would be actually helpful to get some of those families involved as well. These hard-to-reach populations, often acknowledging that you belong to that group is threatening, right? So we have to consider this when we're doing research, do we, even identifying that a child may have autism might cause problems, or the community might not want to really look at this issue or want to participate in a research that's the topic is on autism. So you have to be really clever about how do we overcome these sorts of barriers. And of course, there's often distrust of non-members of the group, and certainly academics. We have a lot of distrust, I think, in terms of many groups out there, because we haven't done a good job of outreach, I think. And so many people think, we're living in an ivory tower, and they're probably right, that we know very little about them and or their communities, we're out of touch, or that all we care about is data, and that we really don't care, what happens after the study, right? And so we have to overcome all these sorts of issues. The other thing that we noticed in the literature, some of the studies that Emily had found, were that the hard-to-reach populations may be especially vulnerable. So that what we're dealing with is not just, a family that has a child with ASD, but we may be dealing with a family that has a child with ASD who's living in poverty, single mother, health problems, unemployment, And so we're dealing with a very complex situation here. And so the quote from this particular study was that those who are not only particularly sensitive to risk factors, but also possess multiple cumulative risk factors, that these people are the ones that are particularly vulnerable. So we do want to have data and make sure that we highlight this as a problem and hopefully change policy so that we can provide the services that these individuals need, because they probably need it even more than some of the people that we've already surveyed. And so some of the lessons that people have learned in the literature from other professions and with other populations is that the vulnerable population and the researchers need to kind of come together here. It's not going to happen very easily. And so there's needs to be a dialogue and a kind of a negotiation going on between researchers and the type of research questions that we're asking and the populations and how to include them in the process of developing these research initiatives. So being aware of different worldviews, the traditions and the different protocols that we're using. We also have to be aware of the historical context. I mean, one very obvious one is with Aboriginal communities. If we're not aware of the historical issues for Aboriginals here in the province or, broadly in Canada, then I think we're really missing a big piece of the puzzle, because we know there's a history of abuse and other very critical things that have happened in the past through the medical system, through the school system, and administrative systems in the province and government that really have led to a high distrust between Aboriginal communities and government, academia, et cetera. And we have to be aware of that if we're going to overcome it. So how to reach hard-to-reach populations? Well, some of the suggestions that were made in the literature, and I think Dr. Grinker also mentioned some of these, that you really have to be very kind of targeted in your approach and think about things very differently, and also be self-aware and recognize your biases to begin with. As a researcher, as an academic, you're coming from a particular culture. And I think you have to consider that before you start to step in and say, okay, now I want to work with this particular community. So you need to think about how is that community-academic relationship or partnership going to happen? And if it does happen, what's it going to look like? And how are you going to make it, how are you going to sustain it? One idea that came up in the literature that we surveyed was that frontline service providers are probably the most helpful people who could sort of build that bridge between the academics and the population that you're trying to reach. Because frontline service providers are the ones who know the population the best. They see them on a daily basis. They talk to them. They recognize all of the challenges and issues that they're facing. You also need advocate members of the community. We talked about this morning, Bosang is an example of that. A person from the community who's taken an advocacy role and really has earned the trust of the community. And therefore people now know and go to him because they're looking for advice or they're looking for ways of improving their family's quality of life. And so partnering with people who take on an advocacy role and are part of the community already gives us sort of academic researchers a little bit more credibility, a little bit more trust. Elders are another example. I think somebody mentioned that this morning as well. I'm forgetting who did. Who said that speaking with elders in their community was, I think it was the South Asian, yeah. Who said in their community it's really important to speak to elders because elders play such an important role in the community. And they're very respected members of the community. So again, another sort of way of developing partnerships there first to earn a little bit of trust and then hopefully get more trust from the community at large. And then the other thing that I found, because I also have a clinical practice, through the families I know in that context, I found that there are families that have small networks of people that they know because they also, they share the common interest in finding out ways to help their child, that word of mouth works really well too. And if you have one family who already trusts you and recognizes that you might be of benefit, to their community, that might be another way in to some of the harder to reach communities. So in terms of a culturally sensitive approach, I think we really still have a lot of hard work there, a lot of research to do about how do we take this on, how do we tackle it. But there have been suggestions about engaging people in the research process from the very beginning. So for example, if I'm working with Bo-Sang, I wouldn't sort of develop my research plan and then say to him, okay, now where do I go to get some participants from the Korean community? I would involve him from the very beginning in designing the research and also talk about the measures that we're using and how appropriate they are and so on and so forth. So it starts from very early on in the process. Involving staff in the project, actually paying people from the community who become maybe research assistants who are involved in the process. I really like the idea, and this is something that we're trying to start. I've been working with some people with autism in my lab, and so getting people with autism actually involved in research and working and getting paid to work on research initiatives. So actually getting people in the community to actually be part of the research actively and to get something back from the research, some immediate benefit. And then you have to culturally adapt materials. I think that's probably the biggest, one of our biggest challenges is how do you take those instruments that have been taken years to psychometrically in terms of getting them to a certain level of precision, and now you have to kind of make them appropriate for a different group. So that probably takes a huge amount of work. And the researcher has to be really open, I think. A lot of us in academia are very rigid in terms of what we do. We tend to like to do things a certain way, and we like to do them very precisely and very orderly, and we don't like messy things. But that's not the way this kind of research works. In fact, it's very messy. And in fact, we have to tolerate a lot of sort of not the usual protocol. And so we always struggle with that. We're still struggling with that. So I'm asking you now, if anybody has any ideas, we would love to hear from you. We really would want to expand this research into maybe target, to look at family quality of life in specific communities or people who are more at risk for, either having a bad experience with the service delivery model here in British Columbia, or not getting diagnosed on time and things like that. If there are any ideas about how we can make this more accessible to communities, or how we can partner with other communities so that we have a more diversified sample, we'd love to hear it. And here's where you can find us if you're interested in this research. Thank you.